dust.
Okay.
Okay, so testing, is that loud?
And then am I just gonna start, or are you gonna introduce me, or
She's gonna
what's?
say hello. I'm gonna go ahead and introduce you probably from there.
Oh, fine.
And then I'll
Okay.
just
Okay.
from there.
And so I'll just be up here, you think?
If you wanted this, you know, I can put the mic here if you want to walk around, whatever
I don't
you
wanna walk
prefer.
around.
Is great.
Okay. I'll just be up here.
Thank you. You're welcome.
Welcome.
Hello. We know of a few more people who are going to be arriving, so we're just going to wait for a moment or two more. But we are delighted that you are here. So. Good afternoon. Good afternoon to those who are here and to those who are live streaming with us. Welcome to Orinda Community Church. I'm the Reverend Elizabeth Robinson, the pastor here, and we are so delighted that you are joining us for our first annual lecture, and we are so delighted that Natalie Baszile is here to share from her work and her thinking with us. A church is really not separate from the community, and we are Orinda Community Church. So we want to really open up to the community, express God's love and how that love works itself out in creativity, in hope, in justice. And we could not think of a better person to represent that ethos than Natalie Baszile. So I'd like to have Mary Vollmer come up and introduce Natalie, and we will proceed from there. So once again, we're so happy to have you here.
Hello, welcome to all of you. It's a pleasure to see you people in the audience. We did not know who would come during COVID time, so it's a real pleasure to have breathing human bodies here. It is also my pleasure to introduce to you Natalie Baszile. All the details. Natalie has a bachelor's from Berkeley, master's in Afro-American Studies from UCLA, MFA from Warren Wilson, and a fantastic first novel that many of you probably already know, Queen Sugar, which was not only a 2014 San Francisco Chronicle Book of the Year, but a nominated book for the NAACP Spirit Award. Not only that, but this book was then transformed into a very popular series on Oprah Winfrey's television network, OWN, and it continues, I think it's sixth season? Seventh season now. Now out of this, and I think Natalie will speak more to this topic, I think too, is out of this book, out of the research and the long period of gestation that brought this book, Queen Sugar, into life, came also the voices of Black farmers that she had not known, and of course we had not heard about either. And one of the things that impresses me most about Natalie over the years is that she cultivates people. She cultivates stories. She cultivates voices. And perhaps she entered into this vocation of writing looking for her own voice, but in fact, what she discovered is a whole community of voices that she has brought to the page and also to the screen. It's with great pleasure that I introduce to you today, Natalie Baszile.
Well, first, I just want to start by saying thank you for coming. This is actually only my second in-person book talk in almost a year. Everything else has been absolutely virtual, so this is a real treat for me to get to interact with people in person. Next, I also want to thank Mary. Mary has been a friend and a friend of my mind for many years now. We met way back during Hedgebrook, maybe? It's been a long time. So I was thrilled when Mary asked me to be your first speaker as part of this series. And I just appreciate her years of friendship and support. So Mary, thank you. Okay, so today I want to talk about my work. I want to talk about the new book. And I want to start by saying that, you know, when Mary called me and she kind of told me what the theme of this series was, it really was an invitation for me to step back from what I do and kind of, you know, reflect on the bigger picture. So often when I'm writing, I feel like, you know, I just have my face pressed against the page and it's just me and the work, and I'm trying to make sense of everything, and I'm trying to hold these stories and these ideas in my head. And it takes a while, I think, to kind of step back from all of that and see the bigger picture. And so The stories and the things I'm going to talk about today are my attempt to kind of zoom in and out on all of these, on my journey. So I'd like to start with a story, because this talk is really about, it's about Black farmers, it's about land, it's about my writing journey, and the person who really launched me on that journey years ago, actually 1999, was a guy named Ramon Bonin. And I happened to have met Ramon at a period in my life when I was really questioning how I was going to do the thing that I felt called to do. I had worked in my family's business for 11 years after I graduated from college, knowing that I wanted to write, but not really feeling the courage, actually, to take the leap. My dad started a business in 1975 that was it was an aluminum distribution business for the aerospace and aircraft industry. And as much as I knew all through college that I wanted to write, I graduated and went back to Los Angeles to help him in this business selling aluminum. And when I tell you that was a soul-killing endeavor, I'm not joking. It nearly killed me. It just wasn't my thing. But by June of, well, I guess by the spring of 1999, I knew in my heart that I wanted to write. But as I said, I hadn't taken the leap. And so this guy, Ramon Bonin, who was a friend and a customer of my dad's, showed up at our office one day, and I don't know what made me kind of confide in him. I think he just had a very calming presence, and there was something about him that made me think I could trust him with my heart's desire. And so I remember we were standing out in the parking lot, and I said to Ramon, you know, I really want to write, and I'm not happy here working for my dad's business, and I can't figure out how to do it. And Ramon said to me, he said, Natalie, make your decision and chart your course. And I am struck to this day by those words, because what he was really telling me was, listen to your heart and find a way to do this thing that you feel called to do. And, you know, as I said, this lecture, this talk really gave me an opportunity to reflect on all of the people who have come into my life, whose paths I have crossed on this remarkable journey that has led me to this day. And Ramon Bonin was that very first person. And when he said those words to me, I was absolutely dumbfounded. And I thought to myself, okay, this is, I hear what he's saying, and I'm going to figure out how to make this work. And so if I were going to map my life as a writer, as an artist, that first pin is with Ramon Bonin. So with those words in mind, I set off on this journey to be a writer. And the first story I wanted to tell was this story that eventually became Queen Sugar. And for those of you who don't know, Queen Sugar tells the story of a young African-American woman. It's a contemporary story, who lives in Los Angeles, but discovers when the book opens that she has inherited 800 acres of sugarcane land in this tiny town in South Louisiana. And so I had this idea for a story, and for the first 5 years that I was writing Queen Sugar, it had nothing to do with land at all. It was just the story of a young woman who leaves LA and moves back to this tiny town. And I was writing the book and writing the book and writing the book, and But people weren't understanding why the main character, Charlie, would pick up and leave. And so one day, I was at home, and I walked into the family room, and I said to my husband, you know, why would somebody leave Los Angeles, even though her life had not gone the way she'd wanted it to in LA? Why would somebody leave Los Angeles and move to a tiny southern town? And very casually, my husband said, maybe she inherits some land. And I thought, oh, wow, okay, that's good. That makes sense to me. That, for some reason, kind of at the cellular level, I felt like that makes sense to me. And so this book that I had been writing, that was basically the same book that we have today, that had nothing to do with land or sugarcane, all of a sudden I had this idea, okay, she's going to inherit some land. Well, this was around 2005, and I'd been working on the book for about 5 years. And by that time, my husband and I and our 2 small daughters had left Los Angeles and moved up to the Bay Area. We'd moved to San Francisco. And it just so happened that there was a young woman, another mom in my daughter's kindergarten class, who was also from Louisiana. And she had a very similar life story to my father, who left Louisiana. But she was my age. Her name was Stephanie Shea. And at the time, Stephanie was having this big 40th birthday party in Louisiana. And she invited my husband and I to come. And so we flew down there. And by this time, my husband had made this suggestion, why don't you have Charlie, your main character, inherit some land? So I thought, okay. So I flew down to Louisiana and traveled around for a few days trying to figure out what crop Charlie would inherit. And I didn't find anything. And by now, the festivities are starting their festivities are underway. And I went to Stephanie, and she said, Natalie, how's the research going? And I said, well, it's not going so great. And Stephanie said, well, what's happening? And I said, I can't find a crop for this character to inherit. And just about as casually as my husband said, she needs to inherit some land, Stephanie said to me, well, you know, my mother owns some sugarcane land. Why don't I take you out there and you can see what it's like? And I said, okay. So we hop in the car, and Stephanie drives me down this little country road and pulls off in the middle of a sugarcane field. And it turns out her mother owned 2,000 acres of sugarcane land. But we pull off into the middle of this field, and it was the middle of July 2005, and it was like, again, one of these moments. So the first moment was Ramon Bonin saying, chart your course, make your decision, chart your course. The second moment was my husband saying, your character should inherit some land. And here we are at the third moment when my friend Stephanie pulls off into the middle of this sugarcane field. And when I tell you it was a magical moment, the sugarcane, I'd never seen sugarcane before, I should say that. I had no idea sugarcane grew in Louisiana, even though that's where my father was from, because he grew up in a different part of Louisiana, and they grew crawfish and rice, and neither one of those were particularly poetic crops. But here I am, July 15th, 2005, I've been working on this novel, and Stephanie pulls off into the middle of this sugarcane field, and it was gorgeous. It was poetic. It was rich, it was visually compelling, and I turned to Stephanie right then and I said, I have the crop for my character to inherit, okay? And in that moment, this book that I had been writing, I could feel that it took on greater significance. All of a sudden, it wasn't just the story of this young woman who moves down to the South. It was this story about land and what that meant. And at the time, I understood a little bit about, sugarcane had this rich history a rich and complicated history that stretched all the way back to the Caribbean, and I could feel the book take on this weight. Okay, so I start writing this book, same character, same idea, but now it has this extra weight to it. Well, I ended up meeting on that same weekend a young guy who was a friend of Stephanie's, and he was on my map, on my journey, he was the next important person. His name was Renee Simone, and at the time, Renee was a bona fide, honest-to-goodness sugarcane farmer. And he had gone to college with Stephanie, and during these festivities, he came up to me and he said, "Hey, Stephanie tells me that you are writing a sugarcane book," because now I'd been there all of 2 days, but the word had spread. And Renee said, "If you have any questions, here's my card, you can give me a call." Well, Renee turned out to be, to this day, one of my dearest friends, and he really taught me everything I know about how sugarcane is grown, how it's harvested, everything that ended up being in the book and then in the series ended up being because of Renee. And so he's this other plot point on this journey where I really feel, looking back, that it was almost like I was destined to be on this path. At the end of the day, I ended up working on Queen Sugar for 11 years. And I will not share the story of difficulty and strife and disappointment, but also triumph. But it was a long journey. And at the end of that journey, the day that I'd finished the book, I had probably revised Queen Sugar 13 times by the time it was all said and done. And I remember lying on my couch in my family room, and I printed out the final version of the manuscript, and it was stacked on the desk, and I was going to put it in the mail the next day. And I happened to see this, Oprah Winfrey used to have this show called Masterclass. And for whatever reason, and when I tell you by this time, I was creatively, intellectually, spiritually spent. I had devoted 11 years of my life writing this story. I had been rejected by agents, and it was just this long story. But that particular day, I was lying on the couch, the manuscript is printed out, I'm going to send it to this one agent, and I was lying on the couch, and I happened to turn to Oprah's Masterclass. And on that particular day, it was Oprah talking to the camera, because normally I think she interviews other people, but on this particular day, she was talking to the camera. And here's what she said. She said, and I wrote it down, and I have this, I used to carry this in my wallet, okay? Here's what she said. God can dream a bigger dream for me, for you, than you can ever possibly dream for yourself. When you've worked as hard and done as much and strived and tried and given and pled and bargained and hoped, and I had done all of those things. Surrender. When you have done all that you can do and there's nothing left for you to do, give it up. Give it up to that thing that is bigger than yourself. Let it then become part of the flow. I have never wanted anything as badly, as hard, as much as as The Color Purple, because she tells the story of wanting this role of Sophia in Color Purple. And I inserted Queen Sugar. And the wanting of it and the surrendering of it is what taught me how to live in the space of letting go. You can dream this much, but God has a bigger dream. So when I ask, what should I do? Should I do this? Should I do that? The bigger question is, what would you, God, the universe, have me do? There is a flow. There is an energy field and a flow that is always happening with us human beings. We just haven't figured out what it is yet or how to channel it, but that is definitely going on. There's an energy field, there's an energy flow that I strongly feel in my own life, and I know lots of other people feel it too. You're either in the flow or you're out of it. And if you're in the flow, it's like this, right? And she does this hand movement. It's like this all the time. It's like flowing with the stream. And the flow is in direct proportion with the center of yourself where God or whatever you think abides, where the universal energy abides, where the divine within you abides. How far you are from the center, from the divineness of yourself, from your connection to source energy, that which created you, is how out of sync you are with your own life, regardless of what you call it. You can align yourself with that. When you align yourself with that, nobody can touch you. So imagine, I'm lying there on the couch, absolutely worn out. I literally barely had the energy to use the remote control. That is how much energy Queen Sugar took out of me. And what do I read? What do I see on television that day? But Oprah Winfrey telling me this. And I was like, she's talking to me. She's describing what these last 11 years have been like. And I thought to myself, okay, I'm gonna release this book, Queen Sugar. I'm gonna trust that if I align myself with what I have to do, I'm gonna let this book go, and I'm gonna trust that it's gonna find its way in the world. And sure enough, Queen Sugar ended up being purchased by Penguin Random House, and about a year later, I get this call from my agent saying, hey, we just got this call from Oprah Winfrey, and she wants to option the book for a television series that is now going into its 7th and final season, starting this week. They're starting production. So I share that story with you because, again, when Mary asked me to give this talk, and I started to think about all of these forces that I feel have come into my life at exactly the right time to tell this story, I had no idea when I started this that I would be talking about and thinking about these bigger issues. But when I look back, I can see all of these little breadcrumbs that have led me to this moment. And it's just been, it's awe-inspiring for me to think that all I did was take that first step on Ramon Bonin's advice, and here I am. Okay, so now we get to the new book, We Are Each Other's Harvest. As a writer, I'm always really excited when I understand how the issues that I'm thinking about, and in this case I was thinking about Black people and land and farming and family and history. I'm always excited when I understand how these ideas fit into a bigger context. I get excited when I can locate my work that often feels, as I said, like I've got my nose just pressed up against the page and I'm just trying to find my way, trying to figure out, how to put one word in front of the next, one foot in front of the next. And then when I have these moments to step back and see how my work fits into these bigger cultural conversations, that's the moment when I feel like, okay, I'm on the right track. And so that's what's really happened with this book. So what I want to try to do now is to provide a little bit of historical context for Queen Sugar and also We Are Each Other's Harvest. What I want to talk to you about is the story of land and the place that land ownership and land stewardship occupies in the American imagination. And really and truly, it doesn't matter if you are interested in farming. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you have connections to farming or not, because what I'm really talking about at the end of the day is using land as a metaphor for these bigger questions about how we think of ourselves as Americans, how we look at our history, how we think about who in this country was invited to participate in this American experiment and who was left out of this American experiment. And that's where these constellation of questions really come into play for me and what I was trying to figure out in this book. Because as I said, when I started Queen Sugar and when I wrote that book, I was thinking about these issues, but there was nobody out there talking about farmers, black farmers. I had not seen that before. But it was interesting to me because kind of in my gut, I was thinking about what does land represent in the American imagination? Who's included in this American story that we tell ourselves, and who's left out? What historical connection do black and brown people have with the land, and how does that connection explain where we are today? Because what I was thinking about and what I wanted to kind of get at, first with Queen Sugar, but now in nonfiction, is this idea that in America, we are really still struggling with this idea about who's included and really who's not. And so the story that I'm trying to tell with land and land ownership, when we step back from that, is like I said, it's really more of a metaphorical. I want you to see land as a metaphor. Okay. What we discover and what I talk about in this book in part is the history of land in this country. And what we see is that the founding fathers, our founding fathers, had very particular ideas about who should have access to land and who should not. And I want to preface this by saying I am not a historian, okay? I am a storyteller, I'm a writer, but I dip into history to help me understand, kind of how my story and my thinking fits into this bigger conversation. And so we can go back to the founding of this country, actually before the founding of this country, all the way back to November of 1618, and something called the headright system, okay? And the headright system was created in Jamestown, Virginia, to attract new settlers to the colonies and to address the labor shortage that was happening in the tobacco fields, because tobacco was kind of the first crop that the colonists, used as a form of, it was the first commodity. The headright system was used mainly in Virginia, Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Maryland. And it gave 100 acres of land to any planter who had been in the colonies since May of 1616, okay? So this was a way to reward kind of the richest people in the country for being here and to help, and their help in establishing the colonies. It gave 50 acres of land to anyone who was willing to cross the Atlantic or pay for somebody to cross the Atlantic and help populate the colonies. Okay, so this is 1616 and 1618. Think about headright, and this headright system is kind of a land certificate. And these certificates were traded the way we kind of trade stocks to this day. This was free land for wealthy Europeans, okay? Free land that the government at the time gave to essentially descendants, white people. Okay, many of the people who came to the colonies were white indentured servants. Okay, we all know this. These were men and women who signed a contract in which they agreed to work for a certain period of time, 4 to 7 years, right, working for the wealthy planter class, in exchange for transportation to Virginia. And once they arrived, they got food, clothing, shelter, and an opportunity to work. These indentured servants were usually poor white English people, ranging from convicted criminals to skilled tradesmen, carpenters, bricklayers, weavers, blacksmiths. And for the first 87 years, really from about 1630 to 1680, 75,000 people came to the colonies. 50,000 of those people were indentured white servants, okay? By 1705, the General Assembly, I think it was the House of Burgess, passed what's called the Virginia Statutes, which required these rich planters, upon manumission, to give their white indentured servants, upon manumission, something called freedom dues, okay? Freedom dues were basically kind of like a launching package that they would give to the people who had worked for them to get them started. And if you were a white indentured man, upon manumission, you got 50 acres of land, 30 shillings in money or goods, 10 bushels of corn, and a well-fixed musket. Okay, this was your package that you got, and then you could go off and live your life. If you were a white indentured woman, you got 15 bushels of corn and 40 shillings. Okay, so right there, that tells you, who gets what. Okay, but land was part of what you got, but you had to have been a white indentured servant. You couldn't be a black indentured servant, or, heaven forbid, if you were enslaved, all bets were off. But land was part of what you got. Again, this was land, cash, and food for white indentured servants. Okay, so 1776, we have the Declaration of Independence, and then in 1785, we have something called the Land Ordinance Act. And that provided a clear system for taking Native American land and putting it in the hands of white settlers, because now we're starting to expand the colonies. This, the Land Ordinance Act gave white settlers who were expanding the territory an opportunity to buy up to 640 acres of land for $1 an acre, okay? Move on to 1790. We have something called the Naturalization Act. And this was a law that limited naturalization to immigrants who were literally defined as free white persons of good moral character, who had resided in the United States for at least 2 years. And again, once you were a citizen, you could have access to land, you could vote, right? Land ownership was kind of the key to being able to participate in this American experiment. Okay, so now we jump ahead about 80 years, and we're at 1862. And there's something called the Homestead Act that allowed white people to claim 160 acres of Western, in other words, Native American land for $1.25 an acre and cultivate it for 5 years. Okay, this is right before the Civil War. This initially excluded most black people because black people were still enslaved. So now we get to the Civil War. And I know I'm really skipping stones here, but I'm trying to show you how land, this idea of land, is part of how we define ourselves as Americans. It's part of what we have told ourselves we value, right? Land and land ownership is really this vehicle for participating in the American experiment. So now we get to the eve of the Civil War. On November 15th, 1864, General Sherman, William Tecumseh Sherman, marches his troops on the March to the Sea, where he goes from Atlanta, Georgia, down to Savannah, 285 miles. And as he's marching, he's destroying all of the plantations. He's burning everything. It is just this it's a strategy of destruction to get the Confederacy to yield, okay? And he's very successful in this effort. Well, at the same time, black people who had been enslaved on these plantations are now beginning to follow Sherman's army, right? Freedom is at hand. So on December 21st, 1864, Sherman captures Savannah. And by this time, he literally had tens of thousands of formerly enslaved people following, they were like refugees, following in his wake. And although the official Union victory was still months away, it seemed all but certain, there were tens of thousands of black refugees who followed Sherman's army. And these people gave Sherman and the US government a glimpse into the problem that they were about to face. And that was, in the post-war South, and that was, what are we going to do with all of these newly emancipated people? And so on January 12th, 1865, General Sherman dispatched his Secretary of War, Edward Stanton, to meet with a group of 20 black ministers in Savannah, Georgia. And Stanton said to them, "State in the manner you think you can take care of yourselves and how you can best assist the government in maintaining your freedom." Okay? Now, by this time, black people in this country, although they had not been allowed to participate and be landowners because they were enslaved, we understood what land ownership meant. Land ownership meant citizenship. It meant power. It meant agency. It meant an opportunity to accumulate wealth. And so in this group of these 20 ministers who'd been assembled, there was a 67-year-old formerly enslaved minister by the name of Garrison Frazier, who was nominated to be the spokesman for the book. Spokesman for the book, oh my goodness. Spokesperson for the group. I'm thinking, all of this is part of what I tell. This is part of the story I tell in this new book. Garrison Frazier was chosen to be the spokesman, and he said to William Stanton, "The freedom, as I understand it, promised by the Emancipation Proclamation is taking us from under the yoke of bondage and placing us where we can reap the fruits of our own labor. The way we can best take care of ourselves is to have land and to turn it and till it by our own labor. We want to be placed on the land until we are able to buy it and make it our own." Okay? So when we think about this story of land, and land as a metaphor, Garrison Frazier understood this. And as the spokesman for the 4 million newly emancipated people, he spoke up, and he was this voice that said, "Give us land." Well, in response to what Garrison Frazier told Secretary Stanton, General Sherman created what is known as Special Field Order 15. And Special Field Order 15 set aside 400,000 acres of land that had been confiscated by the Confederate plantation owners, and he set that land aside for newly emancipated black people. And this 400,000 acres, this is what the order read: the islands from Charleston south, the abandoned rice fields along the rivers for 30 miles from the sea, and the country bordering the St. Johns River, Florida, are reserved and set apart for the settlement of Negroes, now made free by acts of war and the proclamation of the President of the United States. So imagine 400,000 acres along the southeast corridor from Savannah stretching all the way down to Florida was set aside for black people who understood what land meant. And so about 40,000 African Americans were given opportunity to settle on this land. Well, what happens? Lincoln is assassinated, and his predecessor, Andrew Johnson, reverses Special Order 15, Field Order 15, which we know today is 40 acres and a mule. Okay, that's the common name for it. So this was a moment when this country had an opportunity to do the right thing, right? give these people an opportunity to be on the land and determine their own futures. But Johnson reversed that order, and we plummet into, decades, generations of terror and theft and struggle for Black people. And yet, Black people in this country still understood what that opportunity meant, what that glimmer of a promise of Special Field Order 15 meant. One of those people who understood that was my great-great-grandfather. His name was Mac Hall. He was born in 1845. And he, after emancipation, was a beekeeper, a merchant, and a farmer. And eventually he amassed about 600 acres of land in Georgiana, Alabama. So when I tell this story about what land has meant in this country to the white wealthy class, to poor white people, and to enslaved people, it's the same idea, right? It's this idea that land ownership and land stewardship equals freedom and agency and self-determination. Well, Mac Hall, as I said, was my great-great-grandfather. And so this idea of land ownership is something that ownership and land stewardship was something that is I feel it's kind of in my DNA. And so when I look back on Queen Sugar, for example, now I think, well, no wonder I would be interested in this story, because it's kind of been part of the conversation in my family for generations. Okay, well, so here we are, and I'm thinking about all these issues as I'm writing Queen Sugar. And as I'm turning to my new project, We Are Each Other's Harvest, the way that subject came about was I was approached by an editor who said, you can do any kind of project you want. And I thought to myself, okay, so I've explored this idea of land and land ownership and farming in fiction, but now I think I want to do something in nonfiction. And here's why. During those 11 years that I was working on Queen Sugar, and I was traveling back and forth to Louisiana every chance I got, and I'm learning about sugarcane farming, and I'm learning about harvesting, and I'm out there planting sugarcane and all this kind of stuff. What I noticed was that there were very few Black farmers. Very few. As a matter of fact, there were only 5 in all of South Louisiana, from Lafayette to New Orleans. In that whole sugarcane belt, there were only 5 Black sugarcane farmers, and I could not figure out why. How could that be? Why would there be so few? And so that was one of the questions I was thinking about in fiction, but now I wanted to figure out in nonfiction. I wanted to dig back into this idea of land and what it means, but I also wanted to figure out why there were so few Black people who were farmers. And I understood part of that because, during the Great Migration, for example, because Black people had been in the South primarily, and they had experienced so much violence and terror and theft, and because the South, like for my dad, there was no hope for my dad there. And so he left, and he was part of that wave of Black people who left the South and went to California, or went to Baltimore, or went to New York, or St. Louis, all of these urban metropolitan centers in the West, or the Midwest, or the Northeast. And so part of the legacy there, part of the story that Black people were telling themselves at that time was move away from the land. Get as far away as you can get, because there's nothing good that's going to happen. Go to these urban centers, get your education, become a professional. Okay, this is part of our history. But that also meant moving away from not just our ancestry, but moving away from land ownership and land stewardship, which we know is part of the American narrative. I remember the Farm Aid concerts with Willie Nelson and Save the American Farmer, right? I remember those concerts. And so for me, thinking about Queen Sugar and now thinking about We Are Each Other's Harvest, part of what I was trying to explore was, what happened? What happened to Black people? How have we lost this connection to land? Why is this not part of the story that we're telling ourselves? And what I discovered is that by 1920, there were 925,000 Black farmers in this country. By 2017, less than 100 years later, there were only 45,000. Black people in this country used to own 14 million acres of land as farmers. Today, Black people own less than 0.5% of all the farmland in this country. And I know that there's a larger story here about all farmers, right? The American family farm has been purchased by big conglomerates. All American farmers have suffered and struggled, but when you look at what's happened to Black people on the land, when you look at what's happened to Black farmers, that is a very particular story. And a lot of the reason why Black people have lost land has everything to do with the same structures, institutional structures and systems that propped up a lot of white farmers and white landowners for generations. Those same systems, like the USDA, have contributed significantly to Black land loss. Okay? So that's part of what I'm exploring in this new book. But I also wanted to make sure that in the telling of this story of land and land ownership, and really the big question here is really participation in this American experiment. I also wanted to be celebratory, because the truth is, those 45,000 Black farmers who are left are worth celebrating, because they love what they do, and they are committed, and they are joyous, and it's hard work. I'm not going to romanticize it, but they love what they do. And so in this book, what I also wanted to do was let these farmers speak for themselves. I had fictionalized it in Queen Sugar, the book and the television series, and so that had kind of shaken people up, and now Black people and other people were starting to think about land in their families, and my family back in Mississippi owns land, or my family in Louisiana owns land. So there was a narrative there, and people were starting to really rethink about the land ownership that they had in their own personal connection. But now, in this book, I wanted Black farmers and Black land stewards to speak for themselves, and I wanted the readers to hear their stories. And I wanted this to be a dynamic experience because, again, I'm not a historian. When I started on this journey, the idea of combing through archives for the next 10 years made me break out into a cold sweat. But what I do love is people, and I love talking to people. And I'll gather the historical facts, but I really wanted to create a book that told the story of African Americans' connection to the land from emancipation to the present, but I wanted to do it in a way that was dynamic and energetic and celebratory. And so We Are Each Other's Harvest tells part of the story that I shared with you today, and this is the book. But if you can see here on the cover, the two young women are Leah and Naima Pennyman, who are founders of Soul Fire Farm. Because what's also happening right now is that there is a new movement underway among young, not just Black people, but young BIPOC farmers, Black farmers, Native American farmers, Native American farmers, Latinx farmers. There is a movement underway in this country, in addition to young white folks who are allies, who see land differently, right? Who see land stewardship differently. They're seeing this as an opportunity to change their communities, to think differently about capitalism and the way that works, to think about their families, to think about food differently. And they are unapologetic, and they are visionaries, and they are smart, and they are engaging, and they are not waiting. And so I wanted this book to be a celebration of the work that they're doing too. And so this book is really an anthology, and you can dip into it and dip out of it because it's first-person narratives with farmers who tell their own stories. It is essays that I either commissioned or got the rights to. It's portraits of farmers. It's poems. There are poems in this book. I wanted it to be a rich and textured experience so that so that you, the audience, the readers, could see this the way I see it, which is alive, right? It's something that we all can kind of relate to in one way or the other. And so I'm watching the time, but what I really want to do is just read one page from the foreword, and then I want to share a little portion of the poem from the end, and then we can have a conversation, and I'm happy to answer questions. And this will give you a little bit of a sense of kind of my voice in the book, and then also one of the other elements. Okay, so the book begins with this foreword that I wrote, trying to kind of set the scene. Drive east along Interstate 80 from San Francisco towards Sacramento, past vast fields of alfalfa, watermelon, and rice, and you'll eventually come upon a 2-story mural of a solitary figure squinting out across the land. Dressed in a plaid shirt, jeans, and work boots, a tuft of gray hair peeking out under a baseball cap, the figure kneels in a patch of sunflowers. With one hand, the figure cradles a husky yellow Labrador. The other hand points out to the horizon. The figure is a farmer. He is a middle-aged man, and he's white. And if any of you have driven from here up to Lake Tahoe, you have passed this mural that I'm describing. The artist who painted the 20 by 20 foot mural titled Stewards of the Soil says that she meant to pay tribute to the farmers in her community. I don't fault her for wanting to honor them. Farming is difficult work, and I acknowledge that her mural reflects the picture most people have in mind when they envision the American farmer. And yet, every time I pass it, I can't help but think it only tells part of the story. Surely, somewhere across the thousands of acres, there must be a handful of black and brown farmers. Who are they? What stories might they tell if given the chance? And that's really what this book is asking is, who are these people? They're out there. I wanted them to speak for themselves. And so I traveled around the United States, literally all across the South, as far east as far in the Northeast as Petersburg, New York, where Leah and Naima have Soulfire Farm, these 2 young women on the cover. I even went to Alaska to talk to this really wonderful woman, a young woman named Melanie Edwards, who was in farm school in Alaska. And their pictures and their stories are in the book. I went to talk to traditional row crop farmers like the Nelsons and the Bluefords in South Carolina. I talked to queer farmers here. There's a young woman, Mo Brown, who farms in Berkeley, California. I was all over the place because once I went down the rabbit hole, I really went down the rabbit hole. And I started to meet all of these wonderful people who are committed to helping save the planet. They are farming with indigenous farming practices. It's just, I wanted to try to express to people what's going on and who these people are. And I'll close with a poem that I actually asked Naima Pennyman to write, especially for this book. And I won't read the whole thing. I'll just read the last little bit. It's only 3 short stanzas. We are descendants of futurists who did not give up on the possibility at least one seed would survive. The endless tides of transatlantic crossing, auction blocks, monocrop cotton, razor-sharp sugar, the harvest of salt, the scalding sun, and burning crosses, hidden propagation in forbidden gardens, generations of hydration and bondage. Summoning softness from the clouds, our bodies are made of water and promise. Our mothers' mothers did not give up on the possibility at least one seed would make its way through layers of cold, hard, rocky silt and sand and clay. And in the face of great danger, soften its shells, open its hull, extend a tender root, find water and food, trusting there is light somewhere enough to bloom. A flower becomes fruit. Love precedes a child. Someone was dreaming of you. And so I will stop there and say thank you so much. It's been an honor to talk to you today and share a little of, this journey that I have been on that started, again, years ago when I just had an inkling about something that I wanted to do, that I felt called to do. And I have been kind of on this path trying to tell these stories. And I feel very fortunate to have met people who have guided me along the way, everybody from Ramon to Stephanie to Oprah herself with those words on the television screen, to the farmers who trusted me with their stories, and all the other journalists and poets and essayists who are part of this new book. So again, thank you very much for coming here to be patient and listen, and I'll take questions.
Thank you, Natalie. The first question is from online. It's from LaRonda Crosby Johnson, who asks, what surprised you most when you began to look into the current policies that impact Black farmers?
Well, I think, I had heard, I remember years ago, I was young, and I remember seeing the Black farmers who had gathered in Washington in the late 80s. I wasn't that young, but I was kind of young. And they were protesting the USDA, right? And the USDA is the government agency that's created to help the American farmer. And yet it's the same agency that had deliberately deployed strategies and practices to deny Black farmers. And everything from tearing up, on the local level, tearing up farmers' loan applications and denying them loans and all of these terrible things. And I remember seeing Pigford, his name is Mr. Pigford, and he was leading this class action lawsuit. And this was way back in the late 80s, early 90s. And I think the thing that was surprising was to realize that those same practices that those farmers were protesting against in the 80s and 90s were still happening today. That was shocking to me, because I think, like many of us, we tend to think that, these historical things are happening in the past, but they're not alive now. And that was one of the reasons I decided to write this book, was because I was in Louisiana and I met a gentleman who was trying to help Black farmers today. Well, this was 2019. And he was still trying to help Black farmers get out from under these predatory loans that they had been forced to take, or if they had been granted loans at all. And I was shocked by this. And that's, again, the reason why I wanted to use this book as a chance for these farmers to tell their own stories. Yes, the struggles and the hardships, but also, these are stories of resilience and perseverance and courage, and I find them to be tremendously uplifting. But that was a real surprise to me, that that history had not paused, that it was still unfolding.
Any other questions?
Hi. Now that your book is on TV and all of that, and they're going to start production again, do you get to go there and say, oh, no, that's a bird walk, I don't like that? or do they say, no, we're doing this?
Yes, they say, no, we're doing this. I get to go to the set. Pre-COVID, I would try to go once a year and just, pop in and say hi and, watch the story unfold. But no, the writers in the writer's room, they pretty much have taken the story where they want to take it. And it's fine. It's actually fine, because I think that they've done a beautiful job with the story. I think that they have, Queen Sugar is literary fiction, right? I mean, it's a certain kind of book. And to translate that into television, they had to really turn up the dial, right? And make it glitzy and glossy and all these other things. And so it's fun for me to watch, because I get to see how this story that I labored over and kind of, nurtured into being is now in the hands of other creatives who have taken it in some ways in the same direction, but they've blown it up. And that's interesting to see. And my only request when, Oprah and Ava DuVernay optioned the book was, I said, A, give audiences something different that we haven't seen. And B, as long as you can maintain the heart and the spirit of the book, you have my blessing. And that's what they've done. So it's really been fun to just sit on the sidelines and cheer. And then I have the freedom to go on and, do other things. But I don't have any say. None. But I will tell you, sometimes it is fun, like when the new season comes out, my favorite scenes are the farming scenes, when they capture the beauty of the crop the way I know it to be. Okay. Thank you for that question.
Oh, it's wonderful. Thank you. I just have so many questions. But I think I'll start with one that popped into my mind early in your talk. You had gone to Louisiana with the woman that you had met who had family who owned 800
She owned 2,000
sugarcane.
acres. Yes.
Pardon? They owned 800 acres.
Yes.
Oh my.
Yes. My character in the book owns 800.
Oh.
She owns 2,000.
Oh, good heaven.
Yeah.
So at what point in that family history had they obtained all that acreage? That's I'm just curious.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's my understanding that they owned that land really for only a couple generations. My friend Stephanie, her father and grandfather had purchased that land. Not that they were really sugarcane farmers. They weren't out there farming that land themselves, right? They, I think, owned it as an asset. And in South Louisiana, in that belt, they live in New Iberia. And New Iberia is kind of in the heart of sugarcane country. And so they were really business people and owned that land as part of, their family's assets.
Well, it sure is an asset.
It surely is.
Absolutely. Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Did you did you, sorry, did you find out what kind of issues involved in the loan application for the farm?
Mm-hmm.
They were usually in springtime and then end of the year they granted, but in between, what is the
Sure, I can talk about that a little bit. So you're asking about the issues with black farmers and the loans and all that? So here's the way the USDA worked, and this is the problem. I think less so now, but certainly until very, very recently. The problem was the USDA it's a government agency designed to educate farmers about new technologies, programs, special programs that they can participate in, right? There's a body there that is designed to be a lending arm, because every farmer, white, black, otherwise, the way they typically finance their crops, they get a loan in January, right? Or actually probably in October or November, right? And they forecast what they're going to need, because farming can be very expensive. And so they forecast what they will need for operating expenses. They apply for that loan in the late fall, or maybe like in the early winter, January, February, with the idea that they will be able to, if they're given the loan, granted the loan, then they can go out and they can secure their seed and their equipment and their fertilizer, whatever they're going to need, so that come March or April, they can start planting. And they can start planting on time, so that by August, September, their crops have grown, they can harvest their crops, they can sell the crop at the mill if it's sugarcane or whatever. And then in December, after they've made their money, they can pay off the loan and start again. Okay, that's the way it should work. But in a lot of southern states, actually mostly in southern states, but anywhere you had a USDA office, which was primarily in the South or the Midwest, what happened to black farmers is, at the local level, those USDA agents who were in all of the small towns, right? And they were the people who were running the local USDA offices. When a black farmer would come in with their loan application, that local agent really used those federal funds as his real personal pocketbook. And he or she would determine who got the loans. So when the black farmers, like the Nelsons or the Bluefords, when they would bring in their loan application in November, the local agent would literally tear up that loan application, right? Or throw it away, or delay it, right? So that, because what they wanted was, because the USDA agent, he knows all the farmers in the area. And if he could drive the black farmer out of business, the white farmer could come in and take that land, right? For pennies on the dollar. And so what happened generation after generation after generation was that you had these federal agents in these local offices who would, if not deny the loan, would delay the loans so much that the farmer couldn't get the money in time to plant the crop. So for example, Mr. Nelson told me the story of, he went in and put in his loan application in November, and when he would go back to check in December, January, they'd say, oh, nope, we haven't gotten to it yet. Well, we haven't heard anything about it. Well, Mr. Nelson needed that money to go out and get what he needed for the next season. He often would not get that loan approved, if it was approved, because often it was denied. If it was approved, he wouldn't get approval until May. Well, you can't be successful. You can't plant the crop and have it be a successful crop if you're planting in May or June when you should have been planting in March. And so what happens? There's a domino effect, right? If you can't plant on time, you're not going to have a great harvest. If you don't have a great harvest, you're not going to make the money. If you don't make the money, you can't pay back the loan. And so this has been happening to black farmers generation after year after year after year, decade after decade after decade. And so black farmers have been suffering under tremendous debt that they have not been able to repay because the agency that is supposed to help them is constantly undermining them. And then what happens is when these black farmers were not able to pay the loan back year after year after year, then that same government agency comes in and seizes the land, takes that farmer's the land, their house, all of their assets, right? And so this is what the Biden administration, when President Biden first got into office, this is what this Justice for Black Farmers Act was all about. Because remember I talked about Pigford seeing those black farmers on television? Well, they won that class action lawsuit in the 1991. And the government admitted, yes, we have been purposely discriminating against black farmers. But the settlement only gave the few black farmers who got anything an average of $50,000. Well, when you're $1 million in debt, $50,000 is no money. And so Biden's administration had this Justice for Black Farmers Act because he was saying, we are going to settle this. We are going to forgive black farmers all of this debt. Because we know that they're only there because the US government forced this upon them. Well, what happened, just as that was about to happen, Stephen Miller from the previous administration got together with this conservative law firm in Wisconsin and some white farmers, and what did they say? This is reverse discrimination. Yes, because white farmers can't participate. Well, that was actually not true. It was designed for black farmers, Latinx farmers, indigenous farmers, all of whom have suffered, and also women. But because this was an opportunity to again stymie the legislation, now the act is hung up in the courts and black farmers haven't gotten anything. So I hope that kind of gives you a bigger picture of what's happening to this day. To this day.
Good to hear your comments. I'm well aware of that.
Okay.
For a long time.
Okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
My grandfather was a farmer, and I assure you, I know nothing about farming. So in addition to the loss of land, I imagine there's been a huge loss of knowledge.
Yes.
So are black farmers today sort of developing a community of knowledge so they can help one another?
Yeah. So part of what's happening now is this conversation, has kind of bubbled into the larger public consciousness. There are all sorts of groups, small and large, who are really trying to address this constellation of issues. And so yes, there are people now who are trying to, reach out to those older farmers, older black farmers, and often matching them with young farmers who want to farm, who might not have access to the land. So there are lots of things happening now. There's the National Black Food and Justice Alliance that's doing work in this area. There is there's the Black Farmer Fund in upstate New York. There are organizations, nonprofits who are networking to try to address all of these challenges. And that is part of the challenge, is preservation of knowledge. Absolutely.
First, thank you so much for your time and your viewpoint and all of your research and expertise. This has been incredibly enlightening.
Thank you.
So as it happens, my wife and I both come from farm people. And my dad grew up on a farm. And one of the things he said to me was the most important lesson he learned was once you left, you didn't have to go back. He did not like farm life. And so I was, it's a hard way to make a living.
Yes.
I'm sort of interested in your anthology and in all of your interviewing. It's one thing to go into something as a visionary, but man, this life will wear you down. How are you finding your visionary farmers as they, put their back to a heavy load?
Yeah. Well, and I think that's the thing that I am so inspired by, because it is hard. I mean, farming is hard. It is physically exhausting. You've got all the challenges, the financial challenges. It is really tough. And yet, what was interesting to me about you kind of have two buckets of farmers, right? You've got the small kind of organic farmer like Leah and Naima Pennyman of Soulfire Farm, or Earthseed Farm up in Sebastopol, or Urban Tilth in the Richmond, who are farming and growing food on the small, medium scale, and it's all local, right? And even that's hard. And a lot of times they're supported by grants. Soulfire has a whole 10,000 farmers, young farmers, have gone through their programs because they have all of these community days and internship kind of training programs, and they're thinking about it differently. I'm not saying they're making buckets of money. I don't think they are, right? But their focus is different. Their focus is, yes, survival, but they're also, they have CSA boxes, and they're thinking about community. And so their motives, I think, are what is also driving them forward. I think about, there's a young guy who I talk in the book about. His name is Kamal Bell, and he's in Cedar Grove, North Carolina. And Kamal didn't come from farmers, but he is interested in taking he works with young black men from Durham, North Carolina, and he brings them out to the farm. And Kamal is a beekeeper, and he's teaching these young kids about bees and farming. And so it's farming, but again, it's more than farming, and that's what I saw with a lot of the smaller farmers, is they really are like activists, and they're thinking about community, they're thinking about, they're just reframing everything. And now they're existing a lot, with what they make and sell, but also grants and they're in that nonprofit world. And then you have farmers like the Bluefords and the Nelsons, who are farming 3,000 acres of land, or 4,000 acres of land. They don't own it all. They farm it all, they lease a lot of it, because they have, again, they're running into the issues with the USDA. So they own a portion, but they tend to be commodity farmers, right? They're growing cotton, soybeans, rice, something else, I'm blanking. But they are more like big industrial farmers. But they are facing their own challenges. They're surviving, often thriving. And what I loved about their stories, like with the Nelsons, they were saying to me, it's a father and his 4 adult sons, ranging in age from 28 to 40. And when I was on their farm, they want to be farmers. They love it. They figured out how to make it work. I'm sure their margins are thin, but they love the farming, and they are businessmen, and they see themselves as businessmen. And they were saying to me, Miss Baszile, we want to be the biggest farmers in Louisiana. So they have the aspiration. The youngest went back to LSU, I think, and got a degree in business administration, and he came back to the family farm. And so you have that kind of bucket of farmers who are, you know, looking at this. Yes, they're thinking about community and all that thing, but they're also thinking business. They're thinking globally, right? And then you have people like Marvin Frank, who I also tell his story, or he tells his story in the book. Marvin is a retired Special Forces vet. He served 4 tours in Afghanistan and suffered from debilitating PTSD, and actually was in a bad place when his father introduced him to an older black cattle farmer. And Marvin says, it literally saved my life, because it was his, and now he's a cattle farmer in North Carolina. And I was on Marvin's farm this time last year. He now has over 100 head of Black Angus cattle. And so there are stories about people who are finding their way, you know, farming for all of these different reasons. And that's what I find inspiring. But you're right, it's hard. It is tough going. And it just breaks my heart that we could make it a little bit easier for all of these vets who are coming back, you know, and we're not doing what we could, because you've got people who want to, you know, block and stymie at every turn. But I hope that kind of answers your question a little bit.
Brilliant. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hi. The question that I have is, I'm wondering, after doing all this research on farms, has it changed your relationship with the foods that you eat?
Oh man, that's a great question. You know, I mean, how could it not? You know, I think seeing what these farmers go through, seeing how hard they work, I'll give you an example. She's not in the book, but I had an opportunity recently to spend time with Nikiko Masumoto. I don't know if any of you guys know Masumoto's. They're well known in the Bay Area for their stone fruit, their peaches. And I was on their farm for a day, and Nikiko is a 4th generation peach farmer. She works with her dad. And Nikiko and her dad literally touch every peach. I mean, their hands, they and their staff pack those peaches by hand. And so when I go to the market now, you know, I don't mind paying a little bit more for that, because I have seen Nikiko and her dad and, you know, their employees out there, and I've seen the care that they take to harvest that fruit, and they're so thoughtful about it and so intentional that it makes it easier for me, you know, to go to a farmer's market and you know, buy a few more peaches, because I see the labor, the manual labor that is involved, and that has changed my perspective on that. And of course, you know, I think like all of us in the pandemic, there was nothing more chilling than to go into, you know, Trader Joe's and see that the shelves were empty. That was weird and scary. And so I think we all have, you know, experienced, even if we don't think about farming, I think we all have had an opportunity in the last 2.5 years to rethink our relationship to where our food comes from and how fragile these food systems really are.
We're just about out of time, and I want to thank Natalie Baszile with a huge round of applause for people who are here, and a shout out to the people who are online.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
I also want to encourage you to buy both of the books, which are back in the back. Arinda Books has generously come and on her Sunday, Pat, thank you, to provide us with books. And the Black Harvest Fund, too, which is a program that Natalie sponsors, is a wonderful way, again, to support black farmers. And I think what the San Francisco Foundation is...
Right. Yeah, so the Black Harvest Fund is a donor-advised fund, because what I wanted to do with this book, you know, a lot of farmers and trusted me with their stories, and I wanted to do something to give back to them and to give back to the people who are really doing the work, you know, boots on the ground. And so I partnered with the San Francisco Foundation and created this fund that allows me to give money. All the money doesn't come to me, it goes to the San Francisco Foundation. But this fund allows me to issue grants to nonprofits, certified nonprofits, who are helping black and brown farmers across the country. So for example, we've raised $60,000 so far. And I've been able to give grants to the Black Harvest Fund, to the National Black Food and Justice Alliance, to this tiny, tiny little nonprofit in Okolona, Mississippi, called the Mississippi Minority Farmers Alliance. And they train young African American kids in their community who are interested in agriculture. And it's just a way for me to say thank you and to acknowledge the work that these farmers have done. And so some of the proceeds from the book are channeled into that fund, and I have kicked in some money myself, and there are other seed donors who helped me get the fund started, and now, you know, we've gotten some nice grants. So it's been lovely. So thank you, Mary.
Please thank Natalie Baszile for her time and her books and her work and her advocacy, and thank you all for coming to Orinda Community Church on a Sunday evening. There are books for sale, and you're welcome to just loiter in the background and chat and say hey. So thank you very much.